Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm just going to be presenting a little bit of my PhD, which is now completely completed and over and done with. But basically the title of this presentation is Using Taxation to Reduce Demand for High Carbon Food Products. So before I start, well, carbon emissions associated with Scottish food consumption are about 10.6 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's approximately 20% of Scotland's total consumption emissions. However, any time we talk about or discuss modelling food taxes, we have to think about the health issues, especially in Scotland. It's not exactly the healthiest country, to put it nicely. For example, a recent Scottish Health survey found that really adults, there's a suboptimal level of vitamin D intake, and this is especially true in winter, where approximately 50% of the sample were consuming less than 2 to 4 micrograms of vitamin D per day per person, so that's not good. There's also a problem with basically an excess intake of salt. You shouldn't consume any more than 6 grams of salt per person per day. So these are issues that are quite important to think about before a model tax. And so the aim here is, can a carbon consumption tax on food products both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve nutrient intake for the different socioeconomic groups? So you may have noticed all these carbon footprint labels that used to be in the supermarket. Tesco actually withdrew them in 2012, but these give you an idea of the carbon content of the different food products. So how can we actually encourage demand for low carbon food products? Well, on the demand side, we could introduce command and control, and in the supply side, food safety issues, hazard analysis and critical control points is a commonly used method. But in the demand side, it's very difficult for a government to force people not to eat beef or other high carbon food products. It's also very costly to monitor what consumers are actually purchasing, so it's unlikely to work very well. Information provision was found to have very little effect when looking at alcohol or tobacco. So this brings us to price-based approaches. Now, it's not a new concept at all. Basically, Adam Smith even talks about using price-based policy for increasing the price of alcohol to try and improve, I like this bit, to basically improve society because of the supposed tendency to ruin the health and to corrupt the morals of the common people. So it's not a new concept, trying to use taxation to try and basically improve society's health in a certain respect. For this, it's about reducing carbon emissions. So this brings us to a consumption tax, which is just like value-added tax, or if you come from North America, goods and sales tax. But are the effects progressive or regressive? Well, I'm about to detail, at least in health terms, how actually there are some progressive effects. But first of all, the data I used was, first of all, for Scottish household purchase data, I used Kantar World Panel, which is basically a sample of households in Scotland are asked to record their weekly purchasing of food products. So it's a very rich data set. And the carbon footprint data, which probably most people here are more interested in with the carbon background, I used the PAS 2050 carbon footprint data so that I had a common underlying methodology, and I assembled lots of different carbon footprints of food products. And it was all, or mostly all, cradle to grave, so it incorporates the waste stage as well in the LCA. The nutrient data was from the 2008 to 2012 National Diet and Nutrition Survey. This is where a sampler are asked to provide urine and blood samples, and it's a very good way of understanding what food products, what the actual nutrient content is, and also the general health of the population in nutritional terms. And the social group data, I've used the National Readership Survey, which is where you get ranked into these groups, A, B being really the wealthiest, and D, being the most deprived, the lowest socioeconomic group. Oops. So the method that I've used, well, I used what's called carbon nutrient footprint elasticities, and I won't go into much detail about how I actually estimated those, but just to give you an idea, the reason I used these was because I wanted to measure the emissions and nutrient change associated with the tax, which I'll be going into detail about what tax rates I used. To obtain these measures, you first of all have to obtain the price elasticities, which, if anyone's done a bit of economics before, it just measures the responsiveness of a quantity demanded to a change in price. And if you're interested in learning more about this, there's a paper by Young's 1996 where he explains how you can use matrix multiplications to obtain these nutrient and carbon elasticities. But don't worry if you're not interested in that. The important thing is, I used a demand system which estimated these price elasticities. It essentially just captures a consumer's preferences subject to the budget constraint, which I could get from the Cantor data. The system I used was called an almost ideal demand system, and it was devised by this man, Angus Deaton, who's actually a former resident of Edinburgh, and he won last year's Nobel Prize in Economics, so a very big player in the field. The tax calculation, now this is probably the bit that is quite applicable to people with a carbon management background. I formed this based on the carbon footprint of the food product and the carbon price. And the carbon price I used is actually from the Department for Energy and Climate Change, and it's a shadow price of carbon, which is based on a marginal abatement cost curve. So for 2013, the price per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent is approximately £28. Now, this isn't an excise tax. I just want to point out, I found this photo here, which is talking, if anyone's heard about the sugar tax, which is being introduced into the UK in April 2018. An excise tax is applied at production stage, so it wouldn't actually show up in your receipt. What would show up in your receipt is VAT or a consumption tax. So a consumption tax is applied to the end user or of the product, i.e. the consumer. So the tax rates are all correlated to the carbon footprint. So you'll see that the high carbon meat group, which I created from beef and sheep products, attracts a fairly large tax rate of about 45%. Ready-made meals group, which is quite an important group for Scotland, especially for lower income households, as this kind of dominates in some groups in their budget shares, attracts a fairly high tax too. And of course, cheese is almost as bad as meat in terms of the carbon footprints. So that's worth considering at lunchtime, which we're about to have. But the important thing is that there's some problems here. Sugar-sweetened beverages, which contains products like Coca-Cola, Iron Brew, attracts a very low tax because the carbon footprint is so low. So we've got to consider the kind of health aspect too. And I'll just go to the results. First of all, the change in carbon dioxide equivalent. Well, we've seen a largely progressive effect. The wealthiest households see a largest reduction in carbon emissions, and that's because of the substitution effects. For example, C1, when the tax is applied to high carbon footprint meat products, there's a substitution to lower carbon meat products such as chicken, so that partially explains that result. The lower income households are least price sensitive, so in actual fact, when there's an increase in some food products, for example, high carbon meats, they didn't necessarily, for example, DE substitute, as you would think, into another meat product. But in some cases, they just stopped purchasing certain products like cheese. That was a very important one. So the overall reduction is approximately 540,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's only about 5% of the total emissions attributed to food consumption. And relative to the only other study conducted, which was UK-wide, the relative measure was 7.5% that they found. So it's fairly low. So that's why it's important to consider, are there any beneficial health effects? Well, for the first nutrient of interest, vitamin D, not really. There's quite a negative effect for the C2 household groups. That's because, particularly in this group, salmon, which is a very good source of vitamin D, it has quite a high carbon footprint relative to products like chicken. And so when this group reduced their purchasing of this product, their intake of vitamin D decreased too. So that's really not such a positive effect, except the poorest households did increase their intake slightly. For fats and sugars, well, this is quite an interesting result. For fat, the two lowest income households, there's a very large reduction in fats. But for sugar, this is a particularly interesting result. And this was because many of the sugary groups acted as a complement to the high carbon food groups. So if you increase the price of the high carbon food groups, the demand for these groups also decreases. So this is a kind of unintended effect, but actually quite a welcome effect, because sugar consumption is very high, but there's also various health problems such as diabetes, which are related to excess sugar consumption. And for salt, the lowest income household slightly sees an increase in salt consumption, so that's not exactly a very positive result. And energy, well, you saw from sugar and fat, those are related to energy content, that there's overall a decrease. So that's not really much of a surprise there. So the conclusions are, well, is a carbon consumption tax a good policy to introduce? The reduction in carbon emissions is very small. Plus, there's problems with nutrient intake. It's a fairly mixed outcome. So you have to ask yourselves, if you are going to put a tax on products, is this a wise tax to follow? You could devise a system where healthier groups are exempt from tax rates, but then if your sole objective is to reduce carbon emissions, this may not be a very practical method of doing so. So there needs to be a bit more work on carbon consumption taxes. I'm pleased to say I'll be starting a job on Monday where I'll be doing some more work on it. And I just want to finish with this quote from Benjamin Franklin. It actually came from Daniel Defoe originally, but in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. I think that's very relevant today, especially the potential of carbon consumption taxes. And I just want to thank my supervisors, Simon, who's over there, and Cesar. They were both brilliant. They made the PhD really great, and my funders. So hopefully there's maybe some questions or queries. I look forward to hearing any. Oh, good. Yes.
I noticed in a lot of your graphs that C1 group seem to be its own rule. Is that because they're kind of on the kind of pro middle class end where they're quite conscious, whereas the kind of pro above them are probably they don't care as much at that point?
I mean, I think that's quite a good inference. I mean, I couldn't, because obviously I don't know which households, you can't interview them or anything. I mean, that could be quite likely that they may be potentially quite health conscious. It may also just be that the C1 households are still quite high income households. I mean, it's the National Readership Survey is quite odd in that it often ranks households by head of household. So if the head of the household, or it's still quite an old-fashioned term, is maybe for the C1 groups, a more middle management position, but then there's another spouse who's also in a similar position. Their combined income will be quite high. So I think that could explain that kind of anomaly, if you like. I think what's quite interesting is the two lowest income or two lowest socioeconomic income households. There is what you would expect, that they're quite price sensitive in some products, not so much for others. Which is a kind of odd result. But yeah, I think there needs to be a bit more work done actually looking at the more understanding the qualitative viewpoint of these different households. As I say, this was all quantitative data, so it's quite hard to make that kind of inference.
I didn't see all the groups that were in the study, different food types.
Oh, I can go back to, sure.
Account sort of, I suppose, these kind of sort of vegan alternatives, vegetarian alternatives to traditional meat products and dairy products. Were they included?
Yeah, they would be under the grain-based group. Unfortunately, because I was modelling this in a system that I don't know if anyone's aware of degree of freedom's problems, but when you have lots of groups and not so many observations, you can run into some statistical bias. So I had to restrict it really to about 19 groups. But they would be under the grain-based group. It also affects the carbon footprint, because the carbon footprint unfortunately had to be a kind of average for these groups. So I had to also take into account the carbon footprints of the major food products contained within each group had to be quite similar as well. But corn was contained in the grain-based group. But I found obtaining a carbon footprint for corn very difficult, and I'm not sure it's very reflective. And I think this is something, as time goes on and there's more LCA studies, this type of modelling would certainly improve. I think the way I overcame this problem with the carbon footprints in the carbon footprint elasticity point that I made here, the S is actually a share. So by making it a share, you're ranking it. So the highest carbon footprint groups would represent a higher share. So I'm not using the absolute value of the carbon footprint. I had to use it in relative terms because there just aren't enough LCA studies at the moment to be able to do that, unfortunately.
Also looks on that chart like to be the lowest carbon you could be, you'd just be drinking kind of alcohol, milk, and
That's the problem. That's
How
the
was the tax applied? Was it applied by just pure weight, or was it applied by calorie?
It's applied by price. So, for example, if the tax is, say, 45%, we'll round that off, then that's 45% added on to the retail price.
Sorry, I didn't say that very well. What I meant was calculating the tax applied. Was that calculated by the carbon footprint per kilo of the food stuff, or per calorie of the food?
It was per kilo. It was per kilo multiplied by the price. So it's really like saying...
That's why they come out much lower.
Yeah, exactly. It's some studies. There was one study which has modelled a carbon consumption tax, but essentially they've used an excise tax, and I don't think that's very reflective because an excise tax they've applied it more to the producer's price, and they've tried to calculate how much of that would be passed on to the consumer. So it's a kind of called price transmission, but I don't think that's a very realistic way of modelling what the price increases would be. I also think an excise tax in general is quite costly to introduce. It's difficult to actually know just how much the producer will pass on to the consumer, where with a consumption tax you know immediately, like in the UK there are actually some food products, very few products, but there are some which attract the 20% standard rate of VAT, so it's quite easy to work out actually what the price increase will be. So kind of excise tax can distort that slightly.
Do you think there's a case to be made when a particular product has a massive carbon saving and a massive health benefit, likely? Do you think there's a case to be made, okay, just this product, rather than looking at all, should the carbon tax be on every food,
Yeah, the only problem with that is that you could try and do that, but because of all the substitution relationships, that you need to understand if you were to apply it to beef, how that would affect substitutions into other food products. I think there's certainly some scope in that, just applying it to a few food products. I think whatever happens, it would be very difficult. The food industries would not be very happy about it. You're going to be targeting one group. Though incidentally, I don't know if there's anyone from Denmark here at all. No, oh well. Last month, there's a very influential committee in the Danish Parliament which published a report actually suggesting taxing beef products at the consumer stage. So there is actually some scope in doing that. I think whenever you talk about food taxes, it's a very emotive subject, and I can't really see it happening anytime soon. I think maybe 50 years' time, possibly, but I think it's too emotive at the moment. I think the National Farmers Union are too powerful, and I think it's a difficult subject to broach. But I think there is some potential, and the fact that the UK is getting a sugar tax does show we're moving in that direction, so there's maybe some potential. Yeah.
Neil, if you go back to your first slide when you were asking about whether it's progressive or regressive, and you're looking at on I guess a dietary basis. It's the next one on the graph side.
Oh.
It suggests that it is progressive in terms from a carbon perspective, carbon footprint, and that there are reductions. If you translate that into what is it actually doing to my costs to substitute away from certain foods or not?
Yeah.
It would suggest to me that it's actually regressive.
Absolutely. It is regressive from an economic point of view in that the lowest income households have a higher share of their total expenditure on food products. So there's, even from that angle, there's very little kind of dispute about it being regressive in that respect. But I think, looking at it from the carbon reduction side, but also in some of the nutrients, there is some progressive changes. But you're quite right, there is certainly, and I maybe should have emphasized, I wasn't trying to hide that, that there are, from an economic perspective, so that's purely looking at the household budget, this idea of Engel curves, that it is regressive. But that's in all... there was... Yeah, there was a study in Denmark which tried to subsidize different food products as well as taxing them. But in the end, it didn't really change the outcome. I think it's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, I've got 5 years to maybe try and do something like that. But yeah, I think it's really difficult. I think it's difficult to design a system that would do that in a very efficient form. I think you have to accept that it will be regressive from an economic perspective.
Do you think that this sugar tax that will be implemented, if that were to be implemented in conjunction with something like this, that it would help to minimize the negative effects in terms of nutrition? Because the ones that were the lowest were sugary drinks and things like that.
Yeah, I think
they could work well in conjunction with each other.
Yeah, I think in general, if you were to introduce any type of food tax, it would have to be, you'd have to market it for health reasons, but you could also maybe have a kind of side effect where you do try and target the high carbon food products. I think the problem with the sugar tax in the UK, it's quite odd that some products which are actually quite high in sugary drinks are, I mean, they haven't actually laid out the exact products which will be included. I mean, they've put out the thresholds that if it's above 8 grams of sugar per 100 mils, it will attract a higher threshold. If it's above 5 grams of sugar per 100 mils, it will attract this threshold. But there's some debate about actually there should be some more products incorporated into this sugar tax. I mean, I think the fact that it's going to be introduced April 2018 implies that there's a bit of work to be done in the implementation stage, but I certainly think you could kind of combine the two tax forms to try and overcome that problem of, we saw that by a carbon tax, the rate on sugary drinks is so low. I mean, it's less than 1%. So yeah, I think that there's some scope there, I think.
What's the job you're starting on Monday that will build upon this?
Yeah, I'm looking at both the demand and supply side of a low greenhouse gas diet, but we also have to incorporate the health effects. So we're going to, one of the major departures from what I was doing, just working on the demand side, is looking at how it would impact just Scottish agriculture. So I have to kind of take into account the imported food products, and that's going to be one aspect, but also we're going to be, or should I say I am going to be incorporating more of the health elements to try and come up with a diet which is both low greenhouse gas but also meets the Scottish Government's nutrient recommendations for all the major nutrients and incorporates the price elasticities as well. So it should be quite exciting. That's with the University of Aberdeen, but it's also funded by the Scottish Government too. So if you've got any suggestions on any of that, I would be interested to hear. I'm actually going to be based in Edinburgh but employed by Aberdeen, but I'll be going up, so yeah, kind of.
Was the carbon footprints of the foods, was it just Scottish produced foods then, or was it from outside?
This was what I had to incorporate, and this was what I found quite difficult to do. The kind of, from the Cantor data, it didn't break down whether it was imported or not. So I always chose, I had what was a kind of average EU figure for carbon footprints from an Audsley and colleagues study, and I also had rest of the world figures. So for some products like oranges, which could be both EU or rest of the world, I always kind of chose the highest carbon footprint. So I always erred on the side of caution, but that was certainly a problem I had because if you were going to introduce it, farmers would likely say, well, my products have a lower carbon footprint than the competition that's coming in. But in some cases, a really interesting study looking at an LCA for lamb found that New Zealand lamb from cradle to grave coming to the UK has a lower carbon footprint than British produced lamb. Well, there's quite a few reasons. First of all, the actual shipping emissions are very low. So within an LCA, transport emissions, as long as you're not flying, are really very low. Another thing is that the New Zealand farmers require much less concentrate on their grass, so they can have basically their grass is very nutritionally rich for sheep, where in the UK sheep are mainly on hill sheep farms, which are in what are called less favoured areas, which have very poor grass. So they need feed, which is another emission source. And then another problem in New Zealand, or I suppose a good thing for New Zealand, is that the abattoirs are very close to the farms, where in the UK they're not. So that also adds to emissions there. So this is the kind of weird situation that you get. So this is why, food miles are a really bad indicator of carbon emissions. And I know that the National Farmers Union a few years ago tried to put out this idea, buy local, which is fine because buying local there may be other sustainability issues, but from a carbon emissions perspective, it could be quite distortive on that account. Okay, I've just been told I need to finish, so. Oh.
I have one more question, a quick one. Yeah. You mentioned very briefly at the beginning of your presentation about the carbon footprint logo and food that Tesco drew that. Do you know what the reason for that?
Yeah, it was commercial. Basically, when Tesco started introducing them in 2008, along with the Carbon Trust, they believed that other retailers would follow, but nobody else did. And so Tesco cited that it was basically not commercially viable anymore, because to have that label on food products, the Carbon Trust have to revise it. So it's an extra cost for the retailers. So I think that was why. There were also some studies which suggested that consumers weren't actually aware of what the carbon footprint meant. When you got told that your Walker's crisps had this number of grams of carbon dioxide equivalent, it didn't really mean much to the consumer. So I think there were maybe problems with how the label was designed. Maybe if it had a color coding, like the traffic light labels for nutrition, that could have been more effective. But it was unfortunate in that respect. Very good for me, because I could use a lot of the Tesco data, because they did publish the carbon footprint data, but unfortunately it did get removed, because that would be quite an interesting study to look at before and after effects of when they introduced them and how that affected demand. Okay, I think it's now lunchtime, so that's good timing. So I hope it's all low carbon.